where you got the Q&A, the share,
Yep.
and that.
Hey,
You've
we're
also got
broadcasting.
participants.
Yep.
All right, people are arriving. We're going to get started as soon as we hit 1. So just another minute or so. Hopefully more people file in. Just got notifications. Some people's links aren't working, so I'm going to see if I can send some of those over. All right, I think we'll just get started. This is being recorded as well, so we can just share the link with anybody who didn't make it. So thanks for everybody for showing up. Excited to have another little discussion today. This time we're focusing on one specific standardized test that you can do with force plates and with some other devices as well. It's the isometric mid-thigh pull. Pretty simple, straightforward test. Really gained a lot of popularity in the last few years, at least from my perspective. That's what I've noticed. I really like this test personally. A lot of our users are using it regularly. It's very safe, so it's a really nice way to estimate maximal strength without having any risk. You don't need to load up the bar. Very simple. Really, you can do some interesting competitive stuff with this in the team setting, which I really like. And you can also use this test in conjunction with other test results to do some interesting profiling as well. And today we're lucky enough to have Paul Comfort from University of Salford. I'm probably saying that wrong, but that's fine. Paul's done a lot of really awesome research and is continuing to do a lot of research, specifically on the isometric mid-thigh pull. I know he's done a lot of stuff with EMG as well as force. I know he's got some great stuff to share today. So what we're going to do today is just kind of go through things in a fairly, I guess, organized way. And then at the end, what we're going to do is we're going to open it up for questions and answers. And please feel free to post your questions. But if you could, try to use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. That's been something we've figured out over the last couple of webinars that we've done. So I'm very excited to have Paul here. We're also joined by Eric again and Jason Lake, who you cannot see because he refuses to turn his camera on. And then we also have Drake, who is also not turning his camera on or his mic on, and that's fine. He's just observing. But those folks will be around to hopefully answer some questions that we don't get to. And again, I encourage anybody who has questions about this specific topic in this discussion, please reach out. We're always here to help. And the nice thing about having a lot of really smart people around is if it's something we don't know, I don't know, I can always refer to one of these guys who does or who may. So yeah, with that, I'll hand off to Paul now. So I'm going to go ahead and mic myself or mute myself, and then hopefully, Paul, you can share your screen. Just give us a second if there's any technical glitches. So looking forward to seeing it.
You need to stop sharing your screen so I can share mine, Bennett.
All right.
Okay, has that appeared?
Not yet. Yeah, there we go.
There we go, brilliant. Okay, so thanks for the introduction. As Bennett's just said, this is a pretty simple, fast, effective and safe method of testing. You do get a few people that actually complain of a little bit of lower back pain. That's normally because they're performing the test incorrectly, and we'll come to some of that with the queuing later on. But it's a great way of assessing maximal force production, but also rapid force production. So your ability to produce as much force as possible in a short period of time. And one of the interesting things is it's very closely associated with performances in dynamic strength tests and a whole range of athletic tests, from jumping, sprinting, change of direction, etc. It's really easy to actually perform most of these calculations, and actually the most simple ones are generally the best and most reliable variables anyway, which we'll come on to. And ideally you need force plates. You can use a strain gauge, but it is only going to give you peak force. So a force plate or dual force platforms is going to be a much better option if available. So if we look at a little bit of a sort of history of this, Professor Greg Haff and Professor Mike Stone first started looking at the isometric mid-thigh pull test back in about 1994-95. And first published on this in 1997. And as it pointed out, it's gained a lot of popularity probably in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, especially within the research. But at the same time, this has led to all sorts of problems. So one of the first couple of studies, which you've got the references on the screen here, that Dr. Haff published, they actually assessed the joint angles of just the knee joint from sagittal plane video. So the video was basically pointing in from the side, so they could get your knee joint angles during the mid-thigh or the second pull phase of the clean. And that's the way it was always originally meant to be. So the posture should replicate that second pull. And this is really, really important, because if you change the posture, you actually get a dramatic difference in the force time characteristics, whether it's peak force, force at certain time points, rate of force development, etc. They're all reliable. So if you standardize the joint angles that you're at between testing sessions, it will always be reliable and comparable if the same subject or the same athlete adopts the same posture. But this posture, the start of the second pull, always results in the highest forces and the highest forces at certain time points, or the highest rates of force development. However, if you look across all the research, and I'm not going to go through all of it now, but there's a huge range of differences in the postures that have been adopted and reported. Even in this image, there appears to be quite a large forward lean of the trunk, but this should only be a 5 or 10 degree forward lean. So the posture you should be adopting is pretty much that of the start of the second pull of the clean, or if you've got people that aren't familiar with the clean, if you're working with very young athletes, I know down at University of Wales in Cardiff that some of the researchers down there, part of Rodri Lloyd's group, have been looking at very young female gymnasts who don't perform the clean. Then the easiest way of getting them into the correct posture is get them stood upright, go into maximal dorsiflexion, push your knees over your toes, and keep your chest upright. And that gets you in the correct position. If it's collegiate level athletes or older athletes, maybe instruct them to sit as though they were sat on the edge of a bar stool. Obviously, you can't do that with younger athletes because they shouldn't know it. And that posture is the correct posture. But this is, as I've already said, this forward lean here is a little bit excessive. Some of the research that's out there actually recommends 175 degree hip angle. But if you have a 175 degree hip angle with this knee angle, you end up leaning backwards. Now, I've discussed that with some of the researchers, and that was because they were aiming to emphasize this 5 to 10 degree forward lean. So that's vertical being 180 degrees, 175 is 5 degree forward lean. But obviously that can lead to misinterpretation of the people trying to replicate this. And I also think pretty much every single manufacturer of force plates that promotes this test has posted images which are incorrect postures, which again in itself is problematic. Most people don't go and read the research, so won't figure that out. And if they do, that could lead to further confusion. So without going into a huge amount of detail over all those studies, what's recommended is between 125 and 145 degree knee joint angle. That depends on your level of dorsiflexion, and between 140 to 150 degrees hip joint angle, which leads to that 5 or 10 degree forward lean of the trunk. So if you are performing this test, don't just sit the other side of a computer screen, or if it's the Hawkin dynamic force plates staring at your tablet, move to the side of the athlete, check they're in the correct position, shoulders directly above or slightly behind the bar, and they're in pretty much a position of maximal dorsiflexion. And that should look like they're about to start the second pull phase of the clean. I've already said this gives you the highest forces, the highest rates of force development, etc. And it's really important because those do change if you change postures. And what you want to do is monitor your athletes over a period of time and know that you're comparing like with like, and that you haven't gone from a more forward lean of the trunk to a more upright trunk and immediately increased force production just due to a difference in posture. So if we look at what you really need to do, we've already mentioned the posture. So the first thing to do is get that posture correct. Ideally, make sure that the equipment you're using has a cold rolled steel bar so it doesn't flex. If the only thing you've got available is a normal Olympic weightlifting bar and you have to attach that to a power rack, etc., with ratchet straps, that's fine, but it will flex. So it will reduce your force at certain time points or the rate of force development. So if that's all you've got available, that's all you've got available, but it will limit that if you're comparing your values to that in the published literature, which has used a cold rolled steel bar. So what we've got to do is get this 125 to 145 degree knee joint angle, 140 to 150 degree hip angle, so a 5 to 10 degree forward lean of the trunk, so keeping your trunk as upright as possible. And then use a clean grip, so the same grip you would use if you're performing the clean. Don't use an opposing grip. That will still limit your grip, and use lifting straps. There's a little bit of research which indicates that your forces will be lower and your force at different time points and rate of force development will be lower if you're not using lifting straps. And most studies within the research have also used athletic tape and taped the hands onto the bar as well. So there's pretty much zero chance of you losing control of that or losing your grip. Also, if you can, standardize both the grip and the foot width. If you're working with young athletes, you might need to change this. You might not be able to standardize the foot or the grip width as they grow and develop and limbs get longer, etc. You can hopefully see on this image here, this is from Edith Cowan University. They've actually put a grid on their force plate to make sure that it's really easy to standardize that foot placement, not just between trials, but also between testing sessions. Once you've standardized all of that, what you need is your arms fully extended and your trunk needs to be rigid, but ideally minimal, if any, pre-tension. So what you should see in terms of the force trace is that force trace represents body mass. So it shouldn't really be any higher than that. Then, as Jason will have gone through in previous webinars, you need at least 1 second period of quiet standing. So that force trace should be pretty constant and shouldn't be changing. And ideally looking at less than a 50 Newton change in force during that time. Once they're in position, you then need to explain how they're going to perform the test, and it should be to drive their feet into the floor as hard and fast as possible. If you cue them to pull, what some people will do is actually go through more lumbar extension, lean backwards, and it almost looks like the end of a powerlifting style deadlift. That's not what we want. The aim is to assess maximal lower limb force production. So it's driving the feet into the floor, keeping the trunk as rigid as possible with no movement coming through the spine, and that should eliminate or massively reduce any discomfort that you may feel in the lower back. So that's the cue for them. Then you're going to give them a cue, 3, 2, 1, and then shout extremely loud, push, maybe shout, keep shouting, push, 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 really encouraging them, strong verbal encouragement all the way through. You're aiming for about a 5-second drive into the ground, a 5-second effort. Once they've hit their peak and you see the force trace starting to decrease, it's not a major issue if they stop a little bit early. You will find there'll be breath holding as well. So if they're going from a sort of a red to a purple color and you're a little bit concerned, then stopping them a little bit early isn't a major issue. Give them about a 2-minute rest between efforts and then just repeat the process again. So it's a pretty simple cycle that you need to get them going through. Now, what we need to know is, well, what actually is an appropriate sort of looking force trace, and why do we need to have this period of quiet standing? So the period of quiet standing, the force trace should look like this, the solid black line, and then you'll see this increase as force goes up. So this would be a 3, 2, 1 push would start here and force increases. So we need that so that we know when there is an increase in force, and ideally we want to use that automated. I know that Greg Haff down at Edith Cowan University likes a visual inspection of it, and to identify that point, they use bespoke software that they've created where you can zoom into the force trace and then identify that point. That may work pretty well, and they've got research and quite a bit of data show that works. Most people don't have access to that software though. And for the sake of analyzing data rapidly, if you've got an automated system, then 5 standard deviations of body weight appears to be one of the best, most reliable options. If you're looking at a percentage of body weight, 5 standard deviations, an arbitrary figure of 40 newtons, 75 newtons, whatever it might be, it's really important that the athlete is stood still. A subtle movement on that force plate, even them nodding their head when you start counting them down 3, 2, 1, can create a deviation which is greater than an arbitrary figure of 20, 40, 75 newtons. So we need that period of time for them to be as still as possible. We are looking at some other alternative methods for this, which we hopefully be able to update you on in the future, that led by Greg Haff and one of his PhD students down at Edith Cowan University. The main thing is not everyone will have force plates available which necessarily use this approach. So the key thing is standardize what you're doing. If you can only go with a 20 Newton threshold or a 40 Newton threshold, then that's fine. If you're lucky and you've got your Hawkin dynamic force plates, then everything will be working out correctly with the 5 standard deviations of body weight. If you're going to try and write this up for research purposes, clearly state exactly what you've used. There's so many studies which don't state that. And make sure you use the same method every time. You can see here that these different methods result in where it crosses this solid black line. This is where the onset of force has been identified with the different methods. It won't affect peak force, but it'll have a massive effect on force at certainly 50 milliseconds, which may only be about here. So that might maybe halfway up the force trace if we're looking at some of these different thresholds. So it's really important for the force related variables. So the main thing we need to know is what's an acceptable trial. Once you actually get your force data, what we're looking for is at least 1 second of quiet standing with this pretty stable, and that needs to represent their body mass. If it's much higher than body mass, then there's already a lot of pretension. If it's lower than body mass, they're going to give themselves a huge advantage. What they're doing is leaning on the bar and taking some of the weight off the force plate. So the moment they apply all of their mass to the force plate, you get a massive spike in force. So this needs to represent body mass. At the end of the trial, as long as you're sampling for a long enough duration, you can get them to stand completely relaxed, and you should see then that this period of time after the 5 second effort is comparable to this period of quiet standing at the beginning. We also want this rapid increase in force and no counter movement. So there's not a dip down and then an increase. So this on the left hand side would be an acceptable force trace. The right hand side, you haven't got a stable period of quiet standing. This increase in force here, while it might only look small, if you're using a 20 or a 40 Newton threshold, that's probably going to trigger the onset of the pull here. That's clearly not where the onset of the foot pull occurs. And if you use a counter movement here, while this might look subtle, that will magnify the forces and rate of force development here. So we need to try and eliminate those where possible. That's again really important, not to look at your computer screen or your tablet while you're assessing your athletes, but actually watch the athletes, see what they're doing. Stand in front of them, move to the side of them and check to make sure there isn't any counter movement going on. Make sure they've maintained that dorsiflex position. Sometimes what you'll see is just them pushing themselves, almost like the transition phase of a clean, into a more dorsiflex position, which then gives this counter movement effect.
Paul.
We also don't want to see your peak force occurring towards the end of the trial. It should be occurring towards the beginning. If this is the case, discount the trial and repeat. It's only going to take you an extra 2 minutes. And like I said, avoid this counter movement. The other thing we want to see is not that they've stepped off the force plates here, which is what's happened if it goes to zero force, but we actually want to see that comparable force here as the force during that period of quiet standing. So it's really important to try and make sure they've got that. So give them the instructions beforehand to try and keep this standardized. The other thing you need to be looking for is making sure that the peak force between trials is comparable or within 250 newtons of each trial. Now, that is an arbitrary figure. Maybe a percentage of the peak force would be better. Maybe a percentage of their body weight would be better because it will affect it. We haven't looked into that in enough detail at the moment. But this makes sure you get reliable and comparable trials within and generally between sessions. If it's progressively increasing, there's a bit of a learning effect. So keep going. If it's increasing by 300, 400, 500 newtons per effort, keep going until it stabilizes. Normally it will stabilize within 2 or 3 efforts. If it starts to decrease, you've induced fatigue. So you might as well terminate your testing at that point and go with the 2 best trials you had before. So it should be relatively straightforward to get this data. This is what we're looking for here, and we're definitely not looking for something like we've got on the right hand side with even just one of those single errors within there. With appropriate cueing though, normally you get this correct within the first couple of trials, or before you have a testing session scheduled within a training session, get them just to practice the performance of the test, just to make sure they are familiar with it. And that also massively speeds up the whole testing if you've got a whole squad to test. So that sort of leads us on to what variables are we going to look for. So this is zoomed into your force trace. So this, we can't see that period of quiet standing. This is net force, so we've subtracted your body weight from it. Where it crosses the zeros here is the point that force starts to occur, and then at 50 milliseconds we've got force, 100, etc. So what we need to be reporting is peak force, but that should be your net force, so with your body mass subtracted from it, and ideally look at it relative, so ratio scale divided by body mass. That way we can compare between squad members, between age groups, between sexes, etc. if you need to do that. Otherwise, in general, an athlete who's much heavier should be able to produce higher forces. We can also then look at these forces at the specific time points, so at these different 50, 100 milliseconds, etc. But it's really important if we're doing that, we had that period of quiet standing and we identified the onset of the pull appropriately. Rate of force development, some people use, there's a really nice study in Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research by Professor Greg Haff, published in 2015, which looks at a whole range of different methods of assessing rate of force development. And the variability and reliability differs across those methods. So some have just looked from the onset to the peak and taken the slope of that curve. But obviously you can see that varies between these different time points. If you take peak instantaneous, it tends to be the most reliable, but that's a change in force between 1 or 2 milliseconds, which probably doesn't mean a great deal when you're looking at performance and athletic tasks, which take far more than 1 or 2 milliseconds, and that depends on the sampling frequency you're using. So other people have then looked in, and within the 2015 paper that Greg Half did, they looked at moving average windows, so looking across this 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds with a 20 millisecond moving average window, which again is pretty reliable and maybe the best option. However, the problem is rate of force development is never as reliable as force at these different time points. And if you can see the cursor on the screen here, if force at 50 milliseconds increases and goes up here, the slope of the curve increases. So rate of force development has increased. So you don't necessarily have to introduce any extra potential error from calculating rate of force development. You could just go with force at specific time points. And if the force goes up at one time point, the rate of force development has. And the same is true for impulse. Impulse is the area under the force time curve here. If force goes up at 50 milliseconds or 100 milliseconds, the area under that curve must increase. So we know that those will have increased, but we then don't introduce any additional error with by going through the equations to calculate those extra variables. So I've reported rate of force development and impulse in previous studies. Now I just stick with peak force and force at specific time points because it's far more reliable. You can, I'm skipping down to the bottom, we'll come back to power. You can look at force, and we've proposed this in a recent study in the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance, looking at peak as percentage of force at different time points as a percentage of your peak force. Because what we want to know, if your force at 50 milliseconds increases, is that because you've got stronger? So your peak force has increased, or is that because you're able to express a greater percentage of your force more efficiently and more rapidly? Because that will tell us that you've got certain adaptations compared to just the fact that they've gone up because you've got stronger. So it may be worth looking at the two, so we can identify why your athlete can now produce more force at 100 or 200 milliseconds. And it may be just as a product of them increasing their maximal force production capability. So personally, I go with net relative peak force, so the net force divided by body mass, force at specific time points, and again that's net force, and then also look and be mindful of the percentage of peak force which you can generate at those different time points. Some software packages will allow you to get a value of power, which is completely nonsensical. If you look at power as force times velocity, velocity is 0. So we shouldn't be recording power, but we can approximate what the acceleration would be and therefore what the velocity would be from the change in force. That's why it comes up. Please don't report it to your athletes, to your coaches, and please don't try and publish it. I've lost count of the number of papers I've reviewed for publication which I've rejected because they reported power in an isometric test. Power has to be 0 because there is no velocity. So power isn't appropriate within this test because velocity is 0. Be it some of the software packages will give you a measurement of power, so just ignore that. So if we then go on and have a look at some real data, and I'll go through this relatively quickly so we've got time for questions. So this is data off a real athlete. I won't say who it is or what sport, but clearly we've got a relatively low peak force. So this is pre and post a block of training. So we had 20 newtons per kilogram as their relative peak force they were generating. That's pretty weak. We've got collegiate athletes in the UK, and unfortunately the University of Salford, they're not particularly well trained. All of them exceed this. All of our students that actually don't participate in regular training, I know that might sound strange for sports science students, but they can all exceed this. So this is pretty poor if you can only generate 20 newtons per kilo. So that didn't change over a block of training, but the percentage of force that they're producing at 100 milliseconds has increased from 55% of their peak force to 65% of their peak force. So force alone didn't change, but their ability to express force rapidly has increased both at 100 and 200 milliseconds. So they're producing 80% of their peak force within 200 milliseconds, which is pretty good. And it's a 10% improvement in what they were doing previously. The issue is this athlete is pretty weak. I'd be embarrassed if that was what I was producing. So
I was just going to ask if it was you.
No, it's definitely not me. No, I can produce far more than that, luckily. So I also refer to them as athletes, so it's definitely not me. What these athletes were doing, or what this athlete and the group of athletes were doing here, is a lot of sport-specific training, a lot of ballistic, jumping, plyometric type training. So it's not surprising that their force hasn't gone up, or their peak force hasn't gone up, but their ability to produce force rapidly has. The key thing is here, if they're already producing 80% of their peak force within 200 milliseconds, all of you now, if you're looking at what should the athlete focus on now, it's pretty obvious. They're really, really weak. They need to get stronger. And actually, they can produce 80% of that low force within 200 milliseconds. So they really need to focus on getting stronger. So massively reduce the amount of ballistic plyometric type training and focus much more on basic strength-based training, high loads, 80-85% of 1RM or higher. Bilateral is probably going to give you bigger bang for your buck, but as long as you're doing high load training, you're going to get that increase in force production capability. Then if we monitor this again afterwards, we may see that the forces at these time points still go up, but as a product this time of them actually getting stronger. If we then quickly look at the next case study, you've got something similar. So a similar athlete, this was some additional data from the same squad of athletes that we tested. So a 1RM squat, 1.3 kilograms per kilogram, so pretty weak. And 21 newtons per kilo. So again, both of these are telling us similar thing, which isn't surprising because there's a really strong correlation between maximal back squat strength and maximal power clean performance and isometric mid-thigh pull peak force. So that's not surprising that they're coming out as weak on both measures. But the athlete's got a 52 centimeter vertical jump height, which is a pretty good, that's a decent jump. And that's with hands on the hips. What we've also then got here is their propulsive force, the peak propulsive force during a counter movement jump of 18 newtons per kilo. And what we can do is we can actually work out the dynamic strength index. So that's your counter movement jump peak force divided by the isometric mid-thigh pull peak force. And this gives us a ratio of 0.86. So they're basically producing 86% of their force during a jump, or 86% of their isometric force during a dynamic ballistic jump, so the counter movement jump, which means they're pretty efficient at producing forces rapidly. Not as rapid as we looked at in the last case study, because that was 100 and 200 milliseconds. This is going to be produced over greater than half a second with most people on a counter movement jump, some of them getting up to 700 milliseconds. So this is indicative of somebody who again can produce pretty efficient and effective forces rapidly, but they're just generally pretty weak. So loads of ballistic and plyometric training isn't going to improve their jump height dramatically because they're already producing most of their force, around about 86% of their isometric force ballistically. So they've really got to, again, focus on more strength-based training. That doesn't mean you exclude all plyometric and ballistic training, but there's got to be a much greater emphasis on development of strength. And then in contrast, looking at athletes from a different sport, this is the final case study I'm going to provide. We've got an athlete that can squat 2.2 times body mass, pretty much arse to grass, as deep as they could possibly get with good technique. So that's a pretty impressive squat for a team sport athlete in this case. And they're generating over 40 newtons per kilogram. So again, those two tell us exactly the same thing. But they've only got a 38 centimeter vertical jump, which isn't brilliant. It's okay. But considering that the last person that we looked at was getting a 52 centimeter vertical jump, but they were pretty weak, that tells us that this athlete isn't using that force, these really high forces they can generate efficiently or effectively during a dynamic and ballistic task. The dynamic strength index then tells us the same thing. So again, that was the ratio of your counter movement jump peak force divided by the isometric mid-thigh pull peak force. So they're only producing 51% of their isometric peak force during the dynamic task. So this athlete really needs to focus on being able to express their maximal forces much more rapidly during those dynamic and ballistic tasks. And if you looked at this person's training history, they'd gone through cycles of hypertrophy, general strength, max strength with a bit of power built into that. The power was always really heavy load training, very, very little plyometric or ballistic type training, which is actually common for their position in the sport that they play. But this really tells us that this athlete will benefit much, much more from the ballistic and dynamic training compared to a lot more strength training. We can still get them stronger, but they're going to get much more bang for the buck from trying to express these really high levels of force much more rapidly, ballistically, dynamically. And we should be able to get big improvements with a shift in the emphasis to more ballistic and dynamic training, and less, not eliminating it, but less strength-based training. Okay, so that probably leaves us a good opportunity now to go to any questions.
Oh, that was great. Thank you very much. That was extremely thorough, and I think you kind of hit all the potential pain points. One of the things that I wanted to talk about briefly is kind of one of the, I guess, issues folks can have with the isometric mid-thigh pull test is the specific equipment that you need. You need a certain type of setup. You need the ability to adjust for different height athletes, and I think that's one of the reasons people can, I don't know, not complain about this test, but it's just one of the issues that you face. So what do you use currently at Salford for your for your research? I'm very curious as to what your setup looks like.
We're pretty lucky. We've got a couple of systems similar to what you've got being set up in the background, where you can just quickly slide in a bar and adjust the heights. That works really well, and it's pretty portable. You have to make sure though that the base plate is strong enough. One of the setups that we've got, if we get very strong rugby league or rugby union players, the whole thing starts to flex unless you've got 2 force plates on there. So we use a whole range of different force plates. We've got Hawkin Dynamics. We've got the 400 series from the FT700. We've got Kistler force plates. We've got a bit of everything. And for the one, we have to have 2 Kistlers on there so that it actually just prevents the system from flexing. So that's one of the things you need. It makes it very quick to be able to slide a bar through and adjust it for people at different heights. We've also got, if athletes come into our lab, we've got another system where we just use ratchet straps and actually attach a bar to a power rack. That way we can have multiple stations going, so we can test multiple people at once. That is more time consuming if you need to change between individuals, but actually you're in a situation there where as long as you get people of similar heights and double check that they actually need it adjusted to the same height, you can still get through them relatively quickly. And if you've got a 2-minute rest period between, you can just rotate 2 athletes, so you don't have to adjust in between every athlete. It's much better to have the setup though that you've got behind, as long as that doesn't flex as you're performing the task, because you can just slide that bar through and you can adjust. It takes 10-15 seconds in between individuals. The only thing that it is worth doing though is if everyone can see the column behind you where you slide the bar through, is actually have numbers marked on there. It's very common, you'll slide it through, the bar will go at a bit of an angle, and if the bar's at a little bit of an angle, you end up with it different heights on one side compared to the other. And it also makes an awful noise and screeching sound when you pull the thing back out that nobody likes. So we've got multiple setups. That's definitely the quickest and easiest way of changing it between participants. So
yeah, that's great. I think that's you know, we have a rack that we manufacture. We have manufactured locally. It's pretty reasonable, but it is pretty heavy. So we're working on a new design right now that's a little bit more portable, I think.
Yep.
But you know, we do all testing in SolidWorks because our engineers are like, what's the maximum force that this thing should be able to handle? So we use steel for everything, but if you get, I mean, I've seen some custom setups that people have done with wood and with various different materials that seem to work fairly well. But yeah, I think you kind of hit the keys. You want it to be easily adjusted. One of the issues that I've always seen is that pretension question that you had mentioned. I have a hard time with that myself, even running this test, where it's hard not to add a little pretension just to ensure that I don't get a counter movement. And I get that quite a bit, but I think that might have more to do with what you talked about initially in terms of the different angles that need to be sort of hit. So what is the proper positioning? And I think, this presentation will be really helpful for folks who are looking for that information, because you kind of nailed it pretty clearly.
Yeah, well, there's two things. There's one with the sort of rack setup that you've got behind. There is a little bit of give in the system. So that bar at the moment won't be touching the top of the hole that it slid through.
Yep.
So once you get them in position, you almost need that tiny bit of tension, which then the force trace should replicate their body mass plus the weight of that bar, which depending on the bar you're using, they generally range between about 6 and 10 kilos. But that should stay completely stable at that point. You shouldn't hear a sort of a clanging sound as they create a little bit of movement, because then they will slightly change joint angles. The key thing is getting them into that dorsiflex position, so you don't observe that almost scooping transition phase that you get moving from the sort of hang position into the second pull position. So as long as you've maximized that dorsiflexion, that tends to minimize it. Again, the other thing you get the problem with it, that I mentioned earlier, is sometimes people leaning on the bar, which then creates massive increases in force at the early time points, because the way that you've just suddenly applied all of your mass to the force plates. But it's pretty simple to watch out for, and after a couple of trials, you can cue people out of it normally.
What is the what's the highest peak force you've seen on mid-thigh pull?
With athletes that we've tested, up to about, we've had a couple of people hit the 60 newtons per kilogram, but not many. I know in weightlifters, people have reported up to the 70, 75 newtons per kilogram, which is pretty impressive. What we tend to find with team sport athletes, not football or soccer players, as you guys would refer to them, but with team sport athletes, the rugby players, very good normally is up in the high 40s. If they're hitting the 50 newtons per kilo, that's pretty impressive. Down at what we saw earlier, the sort of 20 newtons, that's normally 20, 25 newtons per kilo. That's normally the soccer players who haven't really done much strength training. That's in the UK. It's probably different in other countries, but generally in the UK, they're pretty weak.
Nice. All right, so we've got a whole bunch of questions here, and I want to go through them as best we can. Okay, so I have one from Amit. I hope I'm saying that right. I apologize if I'm totally butchering your name. In our lab, we standardize pre-tension by visual feedback. Athlete is standing on platform without applying any tension on the bar. After 2 to 3 seconds of silent standing, software is presenting 2 threshold lines, which are set at body weight plus 300 newtons. The lines are presented on the laptop screen in front of the athlete. The value of 300 newtons was used based on athlete's feedback. Athlete is applying pre-tension in order to increase force time between those 2 lines of the threshold, and we start pulling from this point. What I want to do now is ask the athlete to stand on the platform and apply small pre-tension. After this, I want to present him with 2 lines of threshold, which will be less than 300 newtons. Of course, he's asking what should that threshold window be, and I think you kind of answered that in your initial. Maybe that's not the best way to do it, I guess.
I think if you've got a setup which will allow you to do that, it's great, because it's giving instant feedback to the individual.
Sure.
And actually see that threshold, that window you want them in. I suppose it's a question of how small a threshold can you get, because any pre-tension will affect the force at the different time points. If you're standardizing between testing sessions, whether it's 100, 300, 500, as long as that's standardized each time and they're pretty much hovering around that exact value, then it's comparable. But it will affect force at different time points. So if you then compare that to published data, which has used the lower threshold or no pre-tension, that will affect the values you're going to be getting. And then it also depends how you work out your net force. Your net force ideally would then be just subtracting body mass, not subtracting the force prior to the
The
onset
quiet
of the
force,
pull.
yeah. So that was a question for follow-up there was, what if you have a body mass already in your software for an athlete? Can you use that relative? That way you kind of account for it, or no? Because that technically you're basically giving them a boost with that additional weight of that bar.
That's the only problem. Is it any thresholds that you're using need to be standardized. Now, ideally, if you can set that marker just above that individual's body mass, you know, if you could build into a software package, however you're doing it, that you've got the body mass plus, you know, a couple of percent, we'd have to identify, we'd have to look at different thresholds. We'd have to try and, you know, is it going to be 100, 200, 500 newtons? That will obviously won't be relative to the individual stood on there. If you've got somebody of 50 kilograms and you've got somebody of 150 kilograms, then, you know, that's probably disadvantaging one as opposed to the other. So as a percentage of their body mass may be a better option. But we'd have to actually look at that in detail and see which is best. What's the minimal or the maximum and the minimum acceptable pre-tension you could have. And you need a system where it gives you that visual feedback for the athlete instantly, which again just adds to the amount of equipment you need. It probably is a very good way of doing it, but it's probably not accessible for most people at this moment in time. So we just go with the minimum pre-tension, look at it visually. As long as that represents their body mass, then that's fine. If it's more than 50 newtons above that, or system mass, if you've got the setup that you've got behind, so you've got the weight of the barbell, we generally discount that trial and go again. We're normally looking for 3 really good trials, and with most people, we can get that within four attempts. Even for people that haven't really performed the test regularly, it's normally within 5 or 6 efforts, and they don't fatigue within that time.
Nice. Awesome. All right, so the next question comes from Tim Sukamel. He's asking if beards allow you to produce greater force during the isometric mid-thigh pull.
If what?
If beards make you produce higher force, yeah.
I would imagine they do.
Yes, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And we say that because Tim does not have a beard. So the next serious question is, what about an iso belt squat? And this actually is a great question from Bryce, because we're working with somebody right now who is building a belt squat rack, essentially. Yep. What are your thoughts on that? And his I can just share this anecdotally. His preliminary results for his PhD research is that the forces achieved with the belt squat are actually significantly higher I think it makes sense, right? Because for me, when I'm doing an isometric mid-thigh pull, the first thing that I feel, the sort of fatigue sets in on my grip. For sure, that's what gives out. It's definitely not lower limb. So if you kind of remove that with a belt squat, does that not provide a better, or more potentially a better solution? I mean, it's more complicated equipment, obviously.
Yeah, well, first of all, that's, the point that you made is a really valid one, that you've got to make sure you use lifting straps and chalk, etc. Ideally, the bar needs a bit of knurling on it, which not all of the bars have, because then it improves your grip as well. And that tends to reduce the associated problems. Although again, with smaller people with smaller hands, that affects them even more than it does if you've got larger hands. So that does have an effect. A belt squat version may be appropriate. What you need to do is actually compare the isometric mid-thigh pull and the belt squat. There are a few studies where people have compared an isometric squat to an isometric mid-thigh pull with varying sort of results. Generally, you get higher forces during an iso squat. Again, because you're not limited with that grip. Normally, not always, but normally you end up with lower forces at different time points and lower rates of force development because of the compression you feel coming through the spine versus spine, etc. And it can be uncomfortable. You certainly can't, like you see on social media, put a pad on there, because again, the pad absorbs the forces you're producing. So any measurement of time restrained measurements is going to be pretty poor.
Yeah, you're not allowed to use a pad for any kind of squat. I think that's kind of a law.
Yeah, if you're going to have to do that, you need to develop your trapezius so you don't need the pad, which would make a bit more sense. So yeah, I think it may have some utility. It'd be nice to see the guy that you mentioned, if he's looking at for his PhD, if he's compared that to the iso pull, to see those results. the key thing again is making sure you standardize those joint angles to make sure they are comparable between the two different tests. And again, it may be an alternative for people. You know, we're not saying just do the isometric mid-thigh pull or just do an isometric squat. Actually, whatever suits your purpose best, whatever gives you most reliable measurements. If you've got people that do lots of heavy squatting, but they don't do any weightlifting variations, you may get better, higher reliability and lower variability from a squat, and vice versa. So again, it would be nice to see with a belt squat if you need familiarization, if you're not used to doing a belt squat. But if it's another method of assessing which relates to performance and other tasks and is reliable, then yeah, fantastic.
Awesome. That's a good question. So in addition, one question about kind of alternative isometric tests. We get a lot of questions about other isometrics, and I think one of the concerns that I always have is how do you standardize that, right? So if you're doing single leg hamstring isometric, if you're doing we have somebody actually in France right now doing some really interesting stuff looking at like isometric calf raises with a sort of custom setup. That's a little easier, but if you're doing like upper body isometrics on a force plate, I can see, I mean, I know it's a little bit more challenging to get all of the right angles, to get the right setup, to have the right sort of design. Is that something you would encourage or discourage? I mean, what are your thoughts on kind of additional types of isometric measurements?
Again, I think the problem is at the moment we don't have enough evidence in the research. There's lots of anecdotal stuff. So you mentioned, you know, the isometric hamstring test. It's being used quite a lot, but there's still lots more research we need to do in terms of, you know, seeing the effect of the different joint angles, the cueing of it, the thresholds that are used to determine how reliable it is, what the measurement error is. So what's a meaningful difference between testing sessions, and whether it actually tells us anything useful to do with performance or injury risk in that case. And the same with a calf raise test. I've seen people doing it with a sort of seated calf raise, with a standing calf raise. The standing one is the one where it's a little bit more difficult because you've got to try and eliminate any involvement from the knee or the hip, which is extremely difficult to do. The seated version, if you get somebody in a position where they are more dorsiflexed or less dorsiflexed, that tends to again affect the forces which are generated. So we definitely need more research in those areas. So if any people listening at the moment or watching this afterwards are interested in doing some research in those areas, it would be great to look at the effects of standardizing posture, cueing, etc. For any of those tests. For the upper body, there's even less research and less people using it, but there are lots of potential options on how you could set it up. We just need to know how exactly how you would position that, and that wouldn't just be looking at your elbow and shoulder joint angles. It would be looking at things like if you're doing a press up or even a row type action, and I've seen that performed previously with a bench put on top of the force plates. You'd have to make sure that the angle between the humerus and the trunk is standardized as well, because up from, you know, if you bench press with a wider grip with your elbows taken way out from your sides, there's a 90-degree angle between your humerus and the trunk, or you bring your elbows in closer, that does affect force production characteristics and the amount of weight you can lift. So it adds in a whole nother level of complexity to it, but we definitely need the research to be conducted in those areas so that we can answer some of those questions. The main thing is, if you're using it for the assessment of your athletes and there isn't the research to inform you at the moment, just standardize exactly what you do. Measure it, standardize it, make sure it's the same between all testing sessions so your data is comparable. And you never know, over the next 6, 12, 18 months, you may get enough data in there which you could use for research purposes anyway.
So awesome. Thank you, Paul. So I have one here from Ryan. He says, hi, Paul. Thanks for today's webinar. Would you recommend using the IMTP for monitoring / fatigue assessing readiness to train? If so, which variables would you pay most attention to?
Okay, well, there's only, I think it's 2 studies that have attempted to do this, and they've used peak force, unless I've missed any of them. And peak force isn't sensitive to fatigue post-training or post-competition, etc. So you're probably going to have to look at force at different time points or time to peak force. And the force at the different time points is probably going to be the best option. So you might want to look at you get greater reliability with the longer the duration. So you might want to look at something like 50, 150, 200, 250 milliseconds. It may be a good method of assessing neuromuscular function and restoration of performance or readiness to train, compete, whatever term you want to use for it. We know that things like a counter movement jump, jump height alone doesn't actually tell you anything because people would modulate their strategy. So you need to look at other variables. So something like this may give you a really good indication, and it's pretty quick and easy to manipulate if you've got a rack where you can just slide a bar in and slide out and get through and test the whole range of people. But there isn't enough research in that area to tell us whether it is an appropriate test or not. But I would imagine the forces at the different time points would be far more indicative than peak force.
Great, perfect. Bob is asking about, okay, so yeah, Bob is asking about the MVP shuttle. Can you basically do some additional? Yeah, so I mean, I think there's some variations on this, but people, Bob, you're the only one that's asked about that specifically, but yeah, so there's one of the issues, you know, if you want to use force plates to measure various things on top of other devices, I think is size, right? So you can get smaller force plates for sure. I know that a lot of people, Tim specifically does a lot with Pasco plates, right? So Pasco plates are pretty functional in that sense, where you can kind of, they're small enough where for isometric tests like this, I think you're not going to worry about some of the issues with Pascos so much, like, you know, landing, right? So there's no landing, so you don't have to worry about it. So Pascos are a good option for that, but we're working on integration with that as well with our software, so that'll be pretty easy to do. I'll talk, Bob, I'll talk with you more about that. Patrick is asking, have you seen any benefit in using augmented feedback on peak force, or is the test itself too rapid for any effect? Any thought on that?
Well, one of our systems, you can actually see the force trace as you're doing it, so you get that you get immediate feedback as you're doing it. It helps with familiarization with people that aren't used to it for the force at the different time points or time to peak force. So trying to get rapid force production so they can see if the force continues to climb up, you know, 2-3 seconds into it. It definitely helps there, but not with peak force. They tend to put in a maximal effort. It's just not necessarily that maximal effort is put in as early as it should be. There's sometimes a pacing strategy with people. So yeah, giving them sort of immediate feedback, being able to visualize it on a screen in front of them is definitely good for rapid force development, but it doesn't tend to, from my experience, affect their peak forces.
Awesome, thank you. We're getting a lot of really good questions, and Jason is just like on fire answering them before I can ask all of them. So I'm just going through some of them right now. But yeah, I think we've covered most of them. One question I had, I think that a lot of people ask, right, is, and I just know this from personally performing enough. We don't do a lot of ISO tests internally at the office for obvious reasons. It can be exhausting, but a lot of times, you know, you'll sort of get, I feel like there's a, you'll get comfortable sort of when you're in the pull, and then at some point you kind of have like this instinct or almost like, it just feels like, oh, I can like kind of lean into it, right? And I've always noticed I can like lean into it and produce significantly higher force. Obviously that's not the same test. And if I'm leaning and I'm actually pulling backward, I mean, there's movement now, right? So one of the challenges developmentally, you know, from a software perspective, it's extremely hard to differentiate between those two things, right? So a lot of those tests will pass in our system because the quiet phase was within threshold. There wasn't an overly excessive counter movement, but I think that's something to consider, is that what I've noticed is sort of those trials where you see, and I can actually pull up an example here from a guy at NSCA. This was at NSCA in Washington last year. So here, this is just our internal database here. And I'm looking at this guy, Simon, who is, he's from the UK. He's not with us today, but this is his trial where, I mean, this is like a classic. This should have failed for a few reasons, but tons of pretension. And then his peak force of 5,264 newtons occurs at the very, very end. So something to consider. I think that's a really, really important, and it's very easy to overlook this issue.
Well, I think there's two interesting points within that. Is we're currently looking with Greg Half and one of his PhD students, Stuart Guppy, at some other potential alternatives to these testing protocols. If you look at some of the stuff that's been done with single joint isometrics, they've looked at a progressive ramped protocol where you're not trying to produce force as quickly as possible, you're just trying to build up to the highest force. And then almost doing pulsed contractions where you almost kick out. Obviously you don't kick out with an isometric mid-thigh pull, but if it's an isometric knee extension, you can. And looking at, are there different alternatives we can do to get higher forces or higher rates of force development, and how reliable are they? The problem is some of the different variations aren't reliable within session or between testing sessions. So we're trying to identify if there are any other ways we can do it to actually get around that. But the really key point that you've just made about, being able to lean back into it, that's where it's really important for the tester not to be staring at the computer screen or the tablet screen, and to move so you can see if something happens. There will be a tiny bit of slack in the system. You think about it, it's isometric. Your muscles aren't necessarily isometric. Your quads, your calves, your glutes will contract. They will shorten, and the tendons will lengthen. There'll be a tiny bit of movement. Dr. George Beckham, as part of his PhD, a few years ago published the changes in the joint angles that occur from the onset of the pull to the end, and there's about a 4 or 5 degree change in joint angles. So there is a tiny bit that occurs. If you see somebody leaning back, though, that's when they might get a bit of discomfort in their spinal erectors. It may be problematic for people that are getting any non-specific lower back pain. But that should be when the test is terminated, and why you should cue them not to pull, but to push the feet into the ground. If you cue people to pull, some of them you'll see actually that shrugging up a little bit as they do it when they first start, and then they'll actually depress the shoulders. Once they start to produce enough force, they will lean back. So it's really important to cue them to drive their feet into the floor, not to pull on the bar. Even though it's an isometric mid-thigh pull, I know the term's misleading. The bar isn't actually mid-thigh, it's above mid-thigh, and it's not a pull, it's a push. But that's because
upper mid-thigh push.
This was first set up with weightlifters, and if you tell them to pull, they pull by driving their feet into the floor. Don't pull by pulling with their upper body like you might get with other athletes who aren't necessarily familiar with the type of movement. So yeah,
that cue is huge. You're right, Paul. That cueing to push is like a game changer for this test. That's been my experience. If you cue push, it's it just changes psychologically for whatever reason.
Cue them to push and move to the side of them, especially if they are lucky enough to have a tablet with a system you guys have got. You can just walk round to the side of them. You can check everything's all right from the front. You can move to the side. It's great. Even if you're hardwired into a laptop or something that you're using, you can go 3, 2, hit the trigger, 1, and then shout push, and you're already at the side of them by that point. So even if you are on a desktop or a laptop, you can trigger it and just move to the side before they actually start the effort. So that's really down to the person coaching it. And as soon as you see that, and if you see it in warm-up trials, that's it. Cancel that trial and make them go again. The moment you make people repeat this test, a few extra times, they'll feel a little bit of fatigue. They'll feel the blood pressure going up as they're holding their breath during it. They generally don't want to do too many efforts that are extra.
Yeah, that's for sure. So a couple of other questions here. I want to make sure we cover in the last couple of minutes here. So who in the field of sport performance, sports science / research are quote unquote doing it right when it comes to the application of the IMTP? And I think Jason answered that. Obviously, Greg down in Australia, Greg Half, your work, Tom Dos Santos, Chris Thomas. And then Jason also mentioned George Beckham and Tim, of course, as well. So, I mean, do you have anybody to add to that list of people that you would kind of recommend checking out?
Yeah, there's Claire Brady, who passed her PhD a few months ago now. It might be longer than that. Who's based at University of Limerick and working out in Ireland. And then there's the guys down at University of Wales in Cardiff with Rodri Lloyd and John Oliver. We've been doing some maximal strength testing there. I won't name the people that are doing it really incorrectly. Just look on social media for some of their posts where they've shown a whole range of really poor postures. to try and promote their research, but actually just discrediting themselves. So you'll see that when you have a look online. So that can give you a bit of a chuckle at times.
I have another good one here from Patrick again. What is the familiarization period? If you're introducing this test to an athlete for the first time, what are the sort of steps that you take them through? How do you kind of show them, or do you?
Okay, so I suppose there's two sort of examples there. If they're familiar with weightlifting and they've done lots of weightlifting and you know they're competent at getting into the right postures and hitting those right positions, you can normally do just a few familiarization trials aiming to get them at sort of a perceived 50%, 75%, 90% of maximal effort, and you'll get 3 good trials within the next 5 maximal efforts pretty quickly, because they're so used to getting into those positions and producing force there. If they're not particularly familiar or competent at weightlifting, and we've done this with people in the past in those situations, what we'll normally get them to do, rather than waste time during a testing session, is during preceding weeks, maybe 1 or 2 weeks beforehand, over 3 or 4 sessions, we'll actually get them to perform an isometric pull. Maybe give them a bit, not even maximal effort, but just give them a little bit of feedback, let them see the force traces, show them what a good force trace looks like, cueing them to drive their feet into the ground, and maybe just doing 4 or 5 efforts up to about the 90% of their maximum in training sessions. You're not using it for testing, so we normally throw it in at the end of a training session. And just doing that 4 or 5 efforts over 3 or 4 sessions, and we're normally fine when we go into maximal effort testing then. We try and avoid people that are not used to the test or not used to weightlifting turning up for a testing session and then just throwing it in straight away. I would imagine you probably can, with good athletes who have got good body awareness, get them to do it. But we've never tried to do that. We've always tried to sort of eradicate any potential errors so that any testing time we have with the athletes is used as wisely as possible. But it's pretty simple with the majority of people. You only get the odd motor moron that just can't do it no matter what you do, but they're the person that actually, no matter what you exercise you introduce, let alone testing method you introduce with them, it takes them multiple attempts to do that. They're normally the person who's the genetic freak, but not actually necessarily the particularly good athlete in terms of being athletic.
Nice. So I have one final question here. This is one that Jason answered with his standard "it depends" answer in the Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to you, Paul, to see if we can get a little bit more of a solid answer here. In an ideal trial, within what time frame should peak force occur? So ideal, let's ignore ideal. Let's just say, is there a pattern for your more powerful or your stronger athletes? Are they getting to peak force more quickly than less strong athletes? What does that sort of look like, just based off of your experience with this test?
We've certainly seen that the stronger athletes tend to hit the peak forces earlier on.
Okay. And when you say early, what would be sort of small time to peak force? Short.
Normally looking around about, and it does vary, but at around about 500 milliseconds. Some of them are peaking a little bit after that. Ideally, you want it within under a second.
Okay.
But it does vary slightly, and it depends on that individual athlete. Strength definitely plays a role within it. Weightlifters produce it generally more rapidly than you get with other individuals. But it also does depend on the cueing and the familiarization to some extent. But somewhere between half a second and a second, you normally find that peak force is pretty much there.
Perfect. So I have a question as well. In terms of the isometric mid-thigh pull specifically, and maybe some slight variations of it, do you think that there's any value potentially in non-athletic populations using this test? What are your thoughts about that? So using this test as part of an assessment for, I don't know, some kind of functional strength. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, definitely. If you look in a lot of the sort of health-related literature, when they assess strength in most people, they'll go with a hand grip strength to infer changes in lower leg strength, which is ridiculous. You know, that for me is problematic. So I think if you did an isometric squat or an isometric mid-thigh pull with people from different sort of health-related populations within research to identify, you know, maybe it could be used for looking at risk of falls in older individuals, or strength capacity in older individuals in relation to things like, you know, age-related decline in muscle mass, sarcopenia, etc. That might be better than looking at something like grip strength.
And Jason, I know you're doing some work with, there's some interesting studies being done right now with using the isometric mid-thigh as a sort of screening tool for a lot of different things. Am I right?
Yeah, loads of cool stuff out there. I'm not going to talk about them though, because it's Paul's show.
It's top secret classified information. I know that the isometric mid-thigh pull is really gaining a lot of traction in military circles as well, where trying to find some means of testing.
Part of the British Army entrance test for ground close combat troops, they have to do 2, but they do it on a crane scale. So they use on its own.
There you go. So that's it. I think that's really interesting because it's, you know, it's a capacity measurement, right? So very simple.
To the other performance tests they have as well. So it's correlated with, believe it or not, the runtime sometimes.
Nice.
Repetition, load, and so that's loading a 20-kilo sandbag up to chest height and a few other bits and pieces like that.
Oh.
Yeah, it's definitely got utility for other more sort of athletic populations. If you're looking at military personnel, you're looking at, you know, first responders, whether that's, you know, paramedics, firefighters, etc. It's definitely going to be a useful test there, because most of them probably won't know how to, you know, go away and do a 1RM deadlift or a squat, etc. But this is a really good way of assessing it. Don't get me wrong, they should all know how to squat and deadlift. If you look at the requirements of some of their job roles, they've got to be picking up and carrying some decent weights. So you'd like to think they all could, but when you look at some of them, they probably can't. But it would be a really good way of screening those individuals to look at their force generating capacities, and it may link to injury risk as well. We know that the biggest predictor from the last few meta-analyses that have been published on injury risk, the biggest predictor of injury is strength or lack of strength. And the easiest way to decrease injury risk is to make those muscles around whatever musculature the injury occurs at with a non-contact injuries, to make them stronger. So it's got potential utility in a whole range of different areas.
Nice. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know that, you know, there's a lot of people are talking about isometrics as, you know, an exercise as well. So doing the isometric mid-thigh pull as a measure is nice, but you can also kind of incorporate it, start recording your training theoretically, depending on your setup. That's interesting. So Eric, did you have anything you wanted to add just in your experience in ice hockey? If not, that's totally fine, but.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the features of the software is that you can tag these tests, right? So for my population, I have a lot of hand and wrist injuries that are preventing our athletes from doing the mid-thigh pull. It is one of the pieces to our testing battery, but with those athletes that just physically aren't able to, we have been able to tag that and utilize that belt squat variation of it. So it's certainly flexible. Tagging that in the system makes it easier to identify which one we're using. The loaded belt squat we're using for tendon loading as well, to create some parameters on how we're progressing our athletes through tendon loading programming and intervention. But I just wanted to point out that I've tried both, and I've found some success tagging that appropriately, and then still getting at least a similar effect out of the tests. We're using it specifically to, I guess, keep accountability on the athletes and keep them engaged in the program. So a little bit different way of use, but certainly been very impactful.
Yeah, I think in the team setting, you can get people pretty pumped up about doing the ISO test, because it's just, you know, part of the cueing is to scream in their face, you know, as loud as you can, right? It's not hard to motivate athletes, at least in my experience.
Too, so
yeah.
So they like testing short.
Yes, for sure. Anything we want to add? Paul?
No,
Jason?
no.
all I want to say is thank you, Paul. That was awesome.
No
Yeah.
problem. Thanks for the invite.
Really good stuff,
You big
as expected.
baby.
And just for everybody here, this recording will be on YouTube later today. As soon as it's ready, and as soon as I can, Photoshop and clean up some of the stuff now. It'll be available. And honestly, like I said before, please don't hesitate to reach out. If you have questions, my email is ben@talkindynamics.com. We're always happy to talk about this. I know that just internally from a development standpoint, we're working the ISO test, as simple as it is from a math standpoint. There's so many other things to consider with it, that Paul, you really just kind of nailed so cleanly. It's a bigger challenge than we expected in terms of how to get it right, because there are so many sort of variables that you don't need to consider. And a lot of those variables are simply related to the equipment that goes with the test, right? So that's something we're going to be doing more work on, the IMTP. It's kind of, or the ISO test, I should say. We call it just the ISO test because you can use a tag to apply it as a mid-thigh pull. You can do a squat, you can do a belt squat, you can do anything you want with it. It's all the exact same measurements, right? So it's nice because there's no integration. So, it's very easy to kind of run the math and all that stuff. But yeah, you really made some amazing points about, there is a wrong way to do this test, and there are bad trials that might pass through your software. And, I'm sort of like thinking right now, I know our development team is on the webinar right now. So we're going to probably have a discussion about how can we improve it. But one of the things that we experience, because most of our users are in a team setting, things like, if the threshold's too tight, we get a lot of phone calls. And I think so we're trying to ensure that we meet that kind of sort of area where, it's acceptable data, it's comparable data. And I think the key, my takeaway from this is just, again, it's kind of the same thing we've been saying, is standardize your testing process. Do it the same way every single time. If your setup requires pre-tension, that's what it is, right? You know what I mean? No big deal, but just be aware that in a sort of perfect setting, in a lab setting, ideally that quiet phase represents the body mass accurately. And I think that's really useful. And I know that we'll get a lot of questions from this, and definitely looking forward to hopefully producing another webinar, or another, we're calling them chats now. Thanks, Drake. Next Tuesday. And also just want to give a quick mention for, we're sort of organizing and helping to run a series over the weekend, starts on Friday night. Coaches versus COVID-19, and that is for raising money for charity to give money to service workers who are unemployed. We've just hit 30 grand on our fundraise, so that's really exciting. That happened today. We've got some amazing companies sponsoring the event, and the list of coaches who are going to be giving presentations is really, really impressive. So if anybody on this today is interested in learning more about that, definitely reach out or check out the website, coachesversuscovid.covid19.com. Our GoFundMe link is there. And also we have a clinic coming up on Sunday. So I'm just going to put in all the plugs at once for our force plates and strength conditioning course that's happening all day on Sunday. It's we're going to be recording it, and it's going to be available to review later on. So if you want to get the CEUs and you want to actually get the content, you don't need to attend the entire course on Sunday. If you can only make it for 1 or 2 sessions, that's totally fine. We have some awesome coaches talking, and Jason will also be emceeing. Yeah, I'm not sure if he knows that yet, but he's going to be helping to MC the course, and we're going to be putting together a really good program. And it's a lot of the stuff we talked about today is how do you make this work in the real world? How do you apply this information to your athletes? I think Paul, your case studies were awesome because it just summed it up so quickly. It's like, look, low DSI, this is the training that this athlete needs to focus on. If the DSI is up closer to 1, wow, you've got a pretty well balanced athlete. Now we need to look at, are they weak, on both? Is that why it's close, peak force? So I think there's a lot of stuff that can be applied to your training with your athletes. And that's kind of what our event on Sunday is going to be really, really emphasizing and focused on. But yeah, just want to thank everybody. Thank you, Paul. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Jason, for joining us today.
No problem.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to something different next week. Hopefully on Tuesday we'll have another meetup. I'm not sure who's going to be on, but mentioned that half guy quite a bit. Maybe we should get him on a video call. I think that would be really cool.
Love it.
Yeah, looking forward to some. We want to do some roundtable discussions, bring some of the top researchers, some of the top coaches kind of together, and just present some basic information to folks so that we can hopefully get rid of some of the maybe less accurate information that's out there. You know, social media is a great tool, but it also has its pitfalls, as we all know. So yeah, I want to thank everybody again, and hopefully we'll see you guys again in the next week or so. So thanks to everybody. We'll be back.
Thanks, Ben.
Take care.